All right, so here we go. It is time to get our AP party started. So welcome to the first review, where we're going to be breezing through the first three topics tonight, our first three units, that is, topics unit 1, 2, and 3. We are going to go through these quickly. This is not going to be literally a reteaching of the units. It's more or less just hitting all the big ideas and the big points that you need to know. And you need to fill in what I don't talk about. So I'll talk about the big ideas, I'll talk about the big events, and then maybe you can start filling in those, odds and ends that add meat to the subject, if you will. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, we're going through this quickly, so let me go ahead and change my screen. Hey, Dana, how you doing this evening? Glad you could join me. All right, so let me get here to this screen right here, and we're rolling. So, as usual, I'm usually lagging behind, or I'm lagging. You guys are lagging behind where I am in the presentation, but don't worry, I'll be watching for your questions or anything you might have in the chat. But we are going to start in units 1 and 2, and I'm going to lump these two units together because it's essentially about colonization. It's going to cover the years of 1491 to 1754. That first year is going to represent pre-contact, before the Europeans arrived in North America, and the bookend, the end of these two time periods, is going to be 1754, and that is going to be the start of the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War. When we look at the big ideas for this particular unit, there's really, I brought them into 4 big ideas. Native populations were diverse and adapted to environments, and they adapted to their environments. Europeans are going to come to the Americas with different goals and different methods of colonization. The Columbian Exchange is going to dramatically reshape both the New World with European influences and the Old World with Native American influences. And then finally, as we move further into these time periods, you're going to see the growth of colonial regions, which are going to develop with very distinct economic, political, and social structures. So these are the big topics we're going to talk about for periods 1 and 2. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Native American societies. What you really need to know is, you need to know, number one, is there were different societies throughout the Americas, all based on their geography, all based on their economics, all based on their varying societal structures. So when you think of Native Americans in North America, in South America, we tend to lump them all together, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of different cultures within the Americas. But let's narrow it down to 5 main regions. You have the Southwest region, who predominantly relied on agriculture. They developed irrigation systems. This is where we're going to see maize cultivation. They're going to grow a lot of corn in these areas, and their homes are going to be built out of adobe, which is like a clay-like substance that you can find in the Southwest. The next area is going to be the plains and the Great Basin. These are typically the Native Americans that we are familiar with, that we see in the TV shows and in the movies and stuff. The tribes you want to, give names to, think about the Sioux, the Apache, the Ute, and they lived a nomadic lifestyle. They typically were hunter. My coffee's going to come up, and I apologize for that. Hunter-gatherers. They're going to follow the game where it goes. And they're primarily going to be hunting buffalo, deer, antelope. And they make up the Great Plains, the midsection of our nation, which is, states like Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, northern New Mexico, northern Texas. That's the Great Plains. The Northeast is the Iroquois. And the Northeast, they were an agricultural-based society. They lived in longhouses due to the vast amounts of timber that was in their area. And they actually formed a governmental structure called a confederacy, where you're going to see a number of tribes come together and form the Iroquois Confederacy. And so this was more of a political alliance. It was not necessarily a social alliance, but it was like when we talk about a confederacy, we're talking about political components coming together, typically for warfare. I got your back, you got my back. We're going to work together to help defend our region, but then we do our own thing. And that's what we saw up in the Northeast. The Mississippi River Valley, trade. Think about the Mississippi River. Because of the location, because of the river, trade was the predominant economic structure of the Mississippi River Valley. The Cahokia is a tribe that you should know. This is who you're going to associate with this part of North America. They're also their homes were made out of, they built great mounds in the fields and stuff like that for worship and for social gatherings and stuff like that. So they're often referred to as mound builders. Now, the Pacific Northwest, we don't talk a lot about that because this is typically up in the Alaska region and stuff like that. But if you see a question about that, let's face it, you got to know about the Chinook. The Chinook based their economy on fishing as well as trade. So that was their structure. And just in these 5 different regions of North America, you can see the vast differences between Native American societies. And that's really what you got to take with you from this first time period, is that these different societies are going to make it very difficult to interact with Europeans, because the Europeans start to view Native Americans as many of us do today. It's just one big group, and they're not one big group. You have to approach them all differently. And so understanding that is going to help you understand some of the underlying problems that existed between Native Americans and the European colonizers going forward. When we talk about the European colonizers and we talk about European exploration, we have to understand their motives. And the simple motives for European exploration is God, glory, and gold. I mean, I can make it sound, a little bit more, formal and talk about economic growth and religious expansion and stuff like that. But it was God, glory, and gold. And that's the easiest way that you can remember it. Now, when we look at the European powers coming into North America, there's 4 main powers: the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English. The Spanish are first to arrive. Their goal is conquest and conversion. They're not looking to work with the Native Americans. They're looking to conquer the Native Americans and convert them to Catholicism. And what we're going to see happen is they see the Native Americans not as partners, but as a labor system. And coming out of that, you are going to see the growth of the encomienda system, a forced labor system that the Spanish yoked to the Native Americans. Now, as we talked about and be familiar with this, is as we go forward, the encomienda system is going to start to fail. And so the Spanish are going to look for a new labor force. This is when you're going to see the introduction of African slavery into North America. It will be the Spanish that first bring it here. Now, contrary to the Spanish, the French and the Dutch looked to build alliances with the Native Americans because they saw value in the knowledge that they had of the region that they were coming to work in. The French and the Dutch relied on the fur trade, so they needed guides. They needed assistance in finding the best, pockets of fur hunting. And so that's why they built alliances with the Native Americans for that knowledge. They are also going to try, specifically the French, are going to try to convert the Native Americans, but it's not like the Spanish where they said you have to convert. They said, would you like to convert? And that's the big difference. The Dutch, it was purely business. That's where they were coming in. The Dutch were building this huge trade empire, and North America was just part of it. Later in the 1500s and the early 1600s, we're going to see England come into North America, and they're going to start settling along the eastern coast of Northern America. And they are settling primarily for profit and for the practice of religious freedom. Those are the main reasons they're coming in. Their relationship with the Native Americans was, well, if you want to help us, feel free, but otherwise just get out of our way. They weren't, their goal wasn't to convert. Their goal wasn't to build long-lasting relationships. Their goal was to come in, build permanent settlements to make money for England. Now, did some conversions take place? Absolutely. Did some of the English share their faith? Without a doubt. But that was not the primary goal of the English Empire. Okay? So make sure you understand that. The Columbian Exchange obviously is going to have an effect on both the new and the old world. As Europeans come into North America, they are going to bring a lot of new products, new germs, and what would they bring? Plants, animals, and germs is what they're going to bring into North America. And so make sure you know some of the things that the Europeans introduced to the Americas. The biggest one is the horse. The horse had a profound effect on Native American lifestyles. And so that's going to change everything for Native Americans going forward. Another thing that's going to change Native Americans is the disease that was introduced by the Europeans. Smallpox being the leading, killer of Native Americans. We're going to see over 90% of Native Americans die due to disease over the next 100 years once they come into contact with the Europeans. Europe, though, also benefits from the Columbian Exchange. Fresh produce and foods are going to come over, like corn and potatoes and tomatoes. And the effect that that has on Europe is a population growth. The lifespan of Europeans starts to grow longer because they're starting to eat healthier. And you will see the population grow in Europe moving forward from contact with the Native Americans in North America. But as I said, the Native Americans are going to be devastated. Disease is going to devastate Native American populations to the point where they're easily conquered. It wasn't that, yes, the Spanish, the English, the French, they had superior weapons and stuff like that. But what made the natives easy to conquer was they were so weakened by disease. And so that's going to start to change the entire landscape of North and South America. All right, moving on to Spanish colonization. I mentioned to you that they're going to come in and they're going to establish the encomienda system. And that was their slave-based labor that they were going to use the Native Americans for in their mines and on their plantations and throughout their entire society. You're also going to see the growth of a caste system within Spanish society, and it's going to be based on race. At the very top is going to be the pure-blooded conquistador, or oh my gosh, I'm drawing a name on the blank, but the full-blooded Spaniards who came over. They will be at the top of the racial caste system. And then it's going to go down to Spanish men who were born in the Americas. And then you're going to have a whole new group of people called the mestizos. The mestizos were a cross between the Native Americans and the Spanish. You'll also have another race form called the mulattoes, a cross between Spanish and Africans. And then at the bottom of the racial caste system, it's going to be African slaves and Native Americans. But this caste system is going to be developed throughout Spanish colonies in both North and South America. You're also going to see something very similar to it in the southern colonies for the English. Finally, the Native Americans. How are they going to deal with all of this? Well, you're going to see Native American resistance. You'll see some passive resistance as far as, slow work ethics and breaking tools and stuff like that, and running away because it was very easy for natives to blend into the environment, and they knew how to break free. But there is going to be armed revolt against the Spanish, and the most famous one, the one you really need to know, is the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt is going to happen in 1680. And you're going to see happen is the Pueblo are actually going to be successful in pushing the Spanish out of their territory. Now, this is only temporary. The Spanish are going to come back. And when the Spanish come back, they realize we might need to work a little bit more with the Native Americans so we don't have all these revolts. So you will see some cooperation, if you will, between the Spanish culture and the Native American culture. Not a whole lot, but enough to keep the natives from rebelling against the Spanish again. Okay? Moving. Labor systems. I mentioned to you that the encomienda system is going to fall on hard times, primarily because of all the disease. Their workers are going to just start dying. And that's going to be what leads to finding a new system through African slavery. So the Spanish are going to establish the Atlantic slave trade, and that's going to start coming into Spanish North America by way of the Portuguese. They're going to become the purveyors of slaves throughout the Atlantic. And chattel slavery is going to become the economic foundation of the Spanish colonies. And that what that essentially means is slaves who are now property. It's going to be introduced into the English colonies in 1619. But in the early 1500s is when it's first introduced to North America. Finally, the British colonial regions, these are going to start popping up towards the end of time period 2, so right around 1607. 1607, you're going to see the very first colonial region established. That's going to be Jamestown. And over the next, 150 years or so, you're going to see distinct colonial regions develop. And they're going to be developed based on the geography, the economy, and the society. Very similar to what we saw with the Native Americans. The 4 regions you need to know. The first region is the New England region. They're going to be settled by the Puritans. Their primary economic structure is going to be shipbuilding and subsistence farming. Remember, in New England, I talked about it with the Iroquois, a lot of lumber, a lot of woods and forests and stuff. So perfect for shipbuilding. They also have a lot of deep water ports. So that's going to help them as well. The next region I want to talk about is I'm going to jump ahead and go to the middle region, the middle colonies. The most diverse region in the colonial societies, the English colonies. You had people from all over Europe coming into the middle colonies. You had all different economic classes. And I say it's a heterogeneous, excuse me, I'm going to get it done. It's a heterogeneous society, meaning a lot of diversity. Their primary economic foundation is agriculture. They're going to be growing wheat and breads and barleys and seeds, kind of winter crops. They're known as the breadbasket of the colonies because of the types of crops they grow. And so that's going to lead to a lot of trade between the colonies and Europe. Finally, I want to get into the southern colonies. Now, the southern colonies are going to be agriculturally based. Now, initially, the labor system is going to be indentured servants. And when we get to our next unit, you'll see why that came to an end. And that will eventually evolve into African slavery like we saw with the Spanish colonies in the Southwest. You have the southern colonies are kind of divided into 2 separate regions. You have the Chesapeake region and the actual southern region. The Chesapeake region is Virginia and Maryland because it's a little bit further north. They're going to be growing a crop of tobacco. That's going to be their primary cash crop. Cash crops are the economic structure that they're going for here. They're making a lot of money. Tobacco is going to be introduced at Jamestown, and it will become the primary source of the economy going forward for the Chesapeake colonies. The southern colonies, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, these colonies are that's where you're going to start to see the plantations coming up. And you're going to start seeing growth of rice and indigo. Now, be careful when you're in Unit 2. When you're talking about early colonial settlement, cotton was not one of their main cash crops. It's rice, it's indigo. And you will see enslaved labor being introduced in the southern colonies at a more rapid rate than you do, say, in Chesapeake and Virginia. But when I say rapid, I mean they're all growing in the number of African slaves as we go into specifically the late 1600s, early 1700s. Okay? So those are the British colonial regions. We're going to see the introduction of governments in these regions. You're going to see probably the governments you should be familiar with is the Mayflower Compact and the House of Burgesses. The Mayflower Compact was the first written form of democracy that was introduced to the English colonies. The House of Burgesses is the first representative government in the English colonies. What you're going to see throughout all 13 colonies is the growth of self-rule. Each colonial region, each colony will develop their own local government. Now, I mentioned to you a few minutes ago that we're going to see a shift from indentured servants to enslaved labor, African enslaved labor. What's going to spur that is Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. This is where you're going to, in Virginia, have the revolt of indentured servants against the ruling class of Virginia. and they're going to be revolting for better treatment. They're going to be revolting for better lands. They're actually going to, make some progress and cause some damage in Virginia, to the point where the ruling class is going to say, we don't want to use indentured servants anymore because of Bacon's rebellion. We want a new labor source that's not going to rebel against us all the time, that's not going to be a temporary labor force. We want a more permanent labor force. And so that's when they're going to start bringing in more African slaves. Now, African slaves were introduced in 1619, but it's not going to be until 1676 where they start to become the primary labor source of the southern colonies. We are going to see a lot of conflict between the Native Americans and the English colonists. You might want to be familiar with some of the different skirmishes they had. Be familiar with the Powhatan Wars from Virginia. Make sure you know about King Philip's War up with the Puritans, and you even might want to know about the Pequot War. What's the common theme across all of these Native American conflicts is going to be land. As the English colonists start to move further and further west, and they're moving it further into Virginia, they're moving further into Massachusetts. As they start to move west, they're moving into Native American lands, and the Native Americans are going to start pushing back. And so that's when you're going to see a lot of these conflicts coming up. King Philip's War is probably the most predominant Native American battle that's going to be fought in colonial times. It's going to be fought up in Massachusetts, and King Philip, also known as Metacom, is going to create his own, confederacy of tribes throughout New England to go against the Puritans to try to push them off their native lands. It is the bloodiest war in American history per capita. So if you took the population numbers of the time, the losses on both sides were monumental for everyone. Puritans are going to end up winning, and that's just going to continue this process, if you will, of America expanding westward, conflicting with the natives, but America keep pushing and keep successfully pushing the natives further and further west. All right, moving quickly. Here we go. Whoops, that is not what I wanted to click. There we go. Let's go into Unit 3. Now we're going into time period 3, and this is when we're going to start getting into the meat of the units. Remember, I told you to study, preparing for this exam. Yes, topics, units 1 and 2 and units 9 are very important, but the vast majority of the exam, including your writing, comes from units 3 through 8. So here we go with Unit 3. The big ideas here: colonial resistance to British policy is going to grow into a revolution. The Enlightenment ideals will shape our government. Our new U.S. Constitution will create a stronger federal government, and you're going to see challenges both on the domestic and foreign fronts that are going to be placed in front of our early presidents, and they're going to have to learn how to deal with these types of challenges. If you saw the previous slide, the years for for Unit 3, 1754 to 1800. 1754, the beginning of the French Indian War. 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson. So we're going from being English colonists all the way to our third president of the United States. So this covers a whole lot of information. So let's get started. If I click the right screen, here we go. So the French and Indian War was fought not between the French and the Indians, but between the French and English, and they were fighting over land in North America. They were fighting over the Ohio River Valley. The English are going to end up winning, and they're going to sign the Treaty of Paris of 1763. The result of this treaty is Great Britain's going to get all the land in North America. France is out. Now, I mentioned this to my afternoon review. The Treaty of Paris of 63 is not that monumental in the grand scheme of things. It's important because France leaves, and it's important because England got the land, but the treaty itself doesn't have a major effect on the colonists at this time. What's going to have a major effect on them is the fact that in 1763, A Native American by the name of Chief Pontiac is going to rebel against colonial expansion into the Ohio River Valley. When the war was won, colonists started to move west, beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This is going to lead to Pontiac's rebellion. As a response to Pontiac's rebellion, that is when Great Britain is going to step in and say, we're going to pass the Proclamation of 1763, which essentially says, colonists, you cannot move west of this line. But had it not been for Pontiac's rebellion, that line never would have gone into place. So you got to remember, as we go through this, there's cause and effect throughout this entire timeline, not just for Unit 3, but all the existing units after that. So this marks the end of salutary neglect. I said a few minutes ago that the colonists were starting to practice self-government, self-rule, doing their own thing. That's what and England was allowing that to happen. England had taxes in place, but they weren't enforcing them. England was allowing them to govern themselves and do their things because England was making money. But after the war, when England spent a ton of money to defeat the French, and now they had to spend money to defeat Pontiac and his rebellion, they're going to institute the line to limit colonial population movement, and they're going to start taxing the colonists to help pay for the war. So salutary neglect, done. I guess if you want to use the Treaty of Paris as a reference point for the end of salutary neglect, I could see you could make that argument, but honestly, it's going to be Pontiac's rebellion that's going to really put all of this into play. All right, let's talk. Let's move it on here. We're going to taxation and colonial resistance. A number of taxes are going to be thrown at the colonists. As I mentioned a minute ago, they were already being taxed. The molasses tax was passed in 1733, but it wasn't as overwhelming as when the British government started sending tax after tax after tax. And then what you're going to see is the taxes are going to become direct taxes. In 1764, the Sugar Act is going to be passed, which was a tax on all sugar and molasses. It was actually just a rewriting of the Molasses Act. But when things really start to turn is in 1765, when the Stamp Act is passed. This was the first direct tax on the English colonists. And what they're going to do is they're going to rebel against that direct tax. It's from the Stamp Act that no taxation without representation is going to be heralded. This is when the colonists are going to say, it's not fair for you to come over and try to govern us now when you've left us alone all this time and we don't have any representation in Parliament. So that's where no taxation without representation goes. Then you're going to see the Townshend Act is going to be passed. The Townshend Act was a series of taxes, including a tax on tea. That's going to be repealed, just like the Stamp Act was repealed. All of the Townshend Act's taxes will be repealed except the tea tax. And things started to be okay until the Tea Act is going to be passed. The Tea Act is going to be passed in 1773, which is going to create a monopoly on the East India Trading Company, that the colonists could only buy that tea. This is going to lead to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is going to really tick off Great Britain. I mean, they've been dealing with boycotts because that was the first thing the colonists did, is they boycotted English goods. They've been dealing with revolts or protest and tar and feathering from the Sons of Liberty. They've dealt with that. But then the Boston Tea Party comes, and the Boston Tea Party is when they dumped all that tea into Boston Harbor, and that cost the Parliament a buku amount of money. And this is what's going to make them mad. And so they're going to pass the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. Those are interchangeable. And as a result of these acts, and these like closed Boston Harbor, stopped self-government, passed the Quebec Act, added a Quartering Act, all of that was in the Coercive Acts. As a result of this, the First Continental Congress is going to form. The First Continental Congress was a meeting of representatives from almost all of the colonies coming together saying, what's happening in Boston with the Coercive Acts is not good. And we need to respond to that. And they're going to send the Declaration of Rights and Grievances to Great Britain saying, hey, listen, we don't like what you're doing. Can you kind of fix it? And within those meetings, they're going to say, this is what we need to do. We need to establish militias within our colonies, not to take aggressive action, not to attack, but to defend ourselves should we need to. And that's what the First Continental Congress decided. So where are they getting all these ideas? What they're realizing is, and there's this movement that's been going on over in Europe that has made its way to North America called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the introduction of these ideas like natural rights and, how government should operate and what the purpose of government was. And people like John Locke came out who said that it's the government's responsibility to protect our rights of life, liberty, and property. And then you're going to have Montague come out and Jean-Jacques Rousseau come out, and they're going to say things like there's this social contract that we have with our government, and if our government is not protecting our rights, if they're not doing their job, meaning protecting our life, liberty, and property, then it's our, duty to get a new government in that will defend our rights. And so this is kind of the thinking that's kind of starting to take shape within the First Continental Congress, moving later into the 1770s. So understanding that, you have all these events being, put together, all this governance from England that's ticking off the colonists. And now they're at their government, and you pair that with these Enlightenment ideals about, hey, wait a minute, we can choose the kind of government we want. And you put these two big ideas together, and you can see where the colonists are starting to move toward this idea of, we got to get out of here. We got to break free. And so that's going to lead to the independence movement. The Enlightenment thinkers not only inspired the men, in the Continental Congress, but they're going to inspire people like Thomas Paine. In early 1776, January, he's going to write a pamphlet called Common Sense. And he basically broke down every reason why the colonists should break free from Great Britain and declare their independence. And he wrote this for everybody. He didn't write it for the elites. He didn't write it for the educated. He wrote it for everybody and anybody because you needed to get all the colonists behind this. And this will eventually lead to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is going to follow the skirmish and the fighting at Lexington and Concord in 1775 because the British are going to try to stop the movement of these militias. That's Lexington and Concord, the first battle of the American Revolution. Then you'll have other battles like Bunker Hill. But it's later. It's July of 1776 that the Declaration of Independence is going to be drafted by Thomas Jefferson. And within that document, they talk about natural rights. They talk about the social contract that exists between the governed and the government. And they talk about this idea of popular sovereignty, that the people's voice, that the people have the power. And all this ties back to the ideas that were introduced to us in the Enlightenment. So this spurs the independence movement. This spurs the American Revolution. Going into the Revolution, on paper, we should have lost. The Patriots did have some advantages. I mean, they had home field advantage, and that's always nice. They had good leadership, and that's good. But, they were going up against Great Britain, who was the number one army in the world. But what's going to happen is at Saratoga in 1777, we are going to defeat Great Britain, and that's going to lead to the French joining us. And with the French alliance, that's going to give us the strength. That's going to give us the supplies. That's going to give us the money to defeat the British. The final battle of the American Revolution is Yorktown. And once the British surrender, this is going to lead to the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris you absolutely need to know. And that's the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Why this one is important is because the United States as an independent nation is recognized. We become our own nation. That's why things change now. Now that we have our own nation, now we got to start governing ourselves, which is what we wanted. We tried first with the Articles of Confederation. We put together the Articles of Confederation in the 1770s during the war, but what we discovered very quickly, it was too weak. The Articles of Confederation didn't have the power to tax. There wasn't an executive branch. There wasn't a judicial branch. And so nothing could get done. But that doesn't mean that nothing did get done, because one thing absolutely got accomplished, and that was the passage of the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787, which created guidelines for bringing new states into the Union. And one of the guidelines in the Northwest Territory, where up to 5 states could be added, was no slavery would be allowed in the Northwest area. And this is the first time that we have looked at legislating slavery in our country. And you would think that it would expand, but it didn't. It was centralized on the Northwest Ordinance. But there were attempts early on to stop slavery in our country, to stop the expansion of slavery in our country. And that's going to be that's going to be a theme that continues for the next 150 years. When we really knew things were bad was in 1786, when a group of farmers up in western Massachusetts are going to rebel against the Massachusetts government. And Shays' Rebellion showed us that our government was too weak. And after Shays' Rebellion, there was a movement to change our government. And that's going to lead us into the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is going to be built at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. After a lot of debate, a lot of negotiation, the Great Compromise is going to be passed, which created our bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives, and a Senate. The House of Representatives was based on population numbers, so your representation in the House was based on the amount of people who lived in your state. The more people in your state, the more representation you had. But to keep it balanced, to keep it equal, the Senate is going to be based on equal representation, where every single state has the same number of senators, 2. And that means every single state has an equal voice. And this debate about representation is important, because when we talk about representation, we just basically talk about how loud of a voice you have. And the more representatives you have in Congress, the louder the voice you have. So that equality in the Senate was very important, because that equalized everyone's vote. Everyone was heard there. Another compromise that was major during the Constitutional Convention is the 3/5 Compromise, which basically said that slaves are not going to be citizens by any means, but they will be counted towards population. And 3/5 of slaves in every state will count towards those population numbers. And that's going to help some states get more representation. It's also going to allow states and the federal government to tax those people more as well. So the 3/5 Compromise benefits states with more representation as well as taxation. The main purveyors, or the main parts of the U.S. Constitution that came from the Enlightenment thinkers, some big ideas, the idea of checks and balances, that we have equal distribution of power across our 3 branches. This idea of federalism. Federalism comes up a lot, guys, and I know I throw it at you a lot, but remember, federalism is the division of power between a state and a national government, and it's supposed to be an equal distribution of power. So one is not more powerful than the other. Finally, we start to see the debate under the Constitutional Convention, where we see the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were pro-Constitution. They wanted to have it ratified as is. The Anti-Federalists were worried that the Constitution created too strong of a central government, so they will negotiate for its passage, and part of that negotiation is going to be the creation of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Constitution will be ratified in 1789. The Bill of Rights will be ratified in 1791. This is going to lead to our early government and the election of our first president. Washington, let me get this really straight across. Look me in the eye. Washington did not become president until the Constitution was ratified. We did not have a president before the Constitution. So Washington will take office in 1791. And he will serve 2 terms. And the big ideas of Washington's, 1789 is when he takes office. Some things you want to know. One of the big things that Washington maintained was neutrality. There was the French Revolution was going on during this time period. They really wanted the United States to get involved, but we could not afford to get involved in another war. So Washington is going to pass the Proclamation of Neutrality. And that's going to establish our foreign policy for the next 100 years or so. During his presidency, you're also going to see another rebellion. This will be the last real rebellion against our government in our country, and that's going to be the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion essentially tested the strength of the Constitution. Shays' Rebellion showed us that the Articles of Confederation were broken and they were weak. Whiskey Rebellion is going to show us that the Constitution is strong and we have the structure we need for a successful nation. The last thing I want you to know about Washington is from his farewell address. Remember, he's going to give advice to the United States when he leaves, advise against political parties, which we're going to see develop. He's going to advise against staying out of foreign entanglements, which we'll get involved in. He's going to advise against debt, which we're going to raise. So everything he advises is against, we actually go against, but he did lay a foundation for what the presidency is going to look like. And for that, we see the precedents that he set over and over again during those first 8 years. Adams is our second president. He is going to have to deal with foreign affairs. He's going to have some problems with foreign affairs, more so than Washington. France and England are at war, trying to pull us in. France wants us to, help them out because we helped them or they helped us in the American Revolution. When we say no, they're going to start attacking our ships. They're going to start impressing our sailors. That's going to lead to the XYZ affair, in which the French government tried to bribe American officials to give them money and bribe before they would even talk about peace. When we didn't pay them off, that becomes known as the XYZ affair. That's also going to be the launching point of the quasi-war, an undeclared naval war between us and France. That's going to go on for about 2 years during Adams' presidency. Because of this, what's going on with the quasi-war, Adams is worried about enemy infiltration. He's worried about people talking against the government. And he's going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts deal with immigration and how long you have to live here before you can become a citizen. Gives the I'm sorry, guys. Gives the president the right to kick out anybody from his country that he feels is a threat to the country. And also the Sedition Acts, which is going to make it illegal to speak out against our government, whether in the press or through speech. As a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to be drafted by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And what they're going to say is the states have the right to nullify laws if they feel that these federal laws are of harm to their state. So at this point, we're still debating on who has the right to interpret the Constitution. And the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions create this image or this idea that the states can interpret Constitution. And that the states interpret the Constitution or a law to be unconstitutional based on their needs and their wants in their state, then they can just nullify it. It's essentially just cut it out of their laws. And so the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to become a practice of the 1800s going forward. And we're going to refer back to those quite a bit, especially when we get into the age of Jackson. So just tuck that one away. But they were drafted in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. We do see the formation of political parties during this time. It's not the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It's the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists believed in a strong central government. They believed in building our economy through industry, and they supported Great Britain. The Democratic Republicans were more of an agrarian-based party. They saw agriculture as the strength of our nation's economy going forward. They supported France. They also believed in states' rights. So those were the two main parties going into the early 1800s. And that's going to, actually that's the end of my slideshow. That's going to lead us to the election of 1800. The election of 1800, you will see Thomas Jefferson, the Democrat-Republican, running against John Adams, the Federalist. And what's going to happen is John Adams, the sitting president, is going to lose to Thomas Jefferson. The election of 1800 is often referred to as the Revolution of 1800 because for the first time in history, you see a peaceful transfer of power between one political ideology to another. And that's going to wrap up time period 3. So it was really fast, 45 minutes to get through those 3 time periods. What we'll be doing in the evenings going forward is I will be doing another time period, 1 per night. So tomorrow night, I am going to be doing time period 4. Start at the same time, 7:30. It's probably only going to last maybe half an hour at the most. But if you have any questions, now is the time that I want you to put them into the chat, because I'll hang out here for about 3 or 4 minutes, seeing if any questions come in. But after that, we're just going to cut it off. So questions about time periods 1, 2, or 3. So we're talking about colonization of the European powers. We're talking about the growth of English regional colonization, and we're talking about the growth of independence in our country. So do you guys have any questions about any of that I can answer? Dana, great. I'm glad that helped. Like I said, I know I went through it fast. What you guys need to do now is if you took notes or whatever, take now and fill in the blanks. Fill in some of those key ideas. Fill in some of those people I didn't talk about. Fill in some of those events I didn't talk about. And try to build a timeline that shows cause and effect. So, an example, the Stamp Act is passed. That's going to lead to the rise of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty are going to protest. They're going to have boycotts. They're going to, tar and feather and threaten tax collectors. That's going to lead to the Stamp Act being repealed. So everything has a cause and effect as we go through history. And so you need, and it's not just in the same time periods. You're going to see cause and effect down the line as well, because we're learning about ourselves in this time period. We're learning who we are as a nation, and we're taking these early lessons and we'll start applying them to later events in history as well. Okay? All right. So that's it. I don't think I can talk anymore because I'm going to start go coughing like crazy. Tomorrow night, I promise I'll be better. I'll bring some tea with me so I won't be hacking all over the screen for you. But anyway, you guys have a fantastic evening. We'll see you on the next one, and good night